After the events of the time loop being restored, things went back to normal for the rest of the Steves. They went on to have their own adventures and grow as a society. This is Rainbow Quest Aftermath, the Red Kingdom. This will be an 8-part series named Rainbow Quest Aftermath, looking at the events of all people who survived past the loop being fixed. This first episode is the Red Kingdom, Episode 1. With M being healthy and out of the machine for a few days now, he decided to check on his new robe that was being made. As he was walking through the Red Kingdom, he saw peace, a peace he had not seen since he became the leader. With Hypno Steve missing and the curse lifted, he was finally ready to properly become the leader of the Red Kingdom. As he walked into the tailor's shop, he noticed that his new coat was on display behind the desk and asked if it was ready, with the tailor confirming his question, and handed it to him. After walking out of the tailor's shop and heading back to his home, M looked at the leader's hat that was in his hand, the one Light Steve had delivered to the professor shortly after M awoke. M was swept over with a wave of different emotions. Now that he was the leader, it was his job to make sure that the kingdom was running smoothly, a role he had hoped for a long time under the former leader, a leader that he looked up to for as long as he can remember. M entered his home once more. He was so used to his house in the woods that even after a few days of living in the leader's house, he was still not quite used to it. As he looked around, he stayed silent. He had been in the leader's house so many times before now. He'd helped him, learned from him. It was bittersweet to be in the building. After sentimentally looking around, running his hand over the walls, he walked up the stairs, looked at the bed, the kitchen, places he had all seen before. M, after reminiscing for a short while, walked back downstairs. Sitting on the couch, he thought for a moment. Memories started to flood in of everything he had been through. The first time he traveled out of the kingdom, meeting Sabre, the corrected son, the darkness, the shadow sword, Hypno, everything that was a result of that one decision to venture out. He sat in silence, thinking for a moment. What if he had never left the kingdom? Yes, Elemental probably wouldn't have attacked the leader, but he would have never met some of the people who would become his best friends. He would have been stuck in the kingdom for the rest of his life, not knowing about the outside world any more than what was in the local library. In a single moment, M was washed over with a wave of different emotions and a spark of inspiration, an inspiration telling him that he needed to talk to the professor. As M ran toward the professor's lab, he stopped at the doorway and looked up at the building. He hadn't entered it since he was let out of the machine, and in that time after, the professor had repaired it, up from the damage caused by Hypno. M looked down, maybe out of sorrow from what had happened with Elemental, or out of shame of what the leader had become. Not even he knew. He opened the door and walked into the lab, suspecting that the professor was most likely in the basement, as that's where he spent most of his time. As he walked down the stairs into the main laboratory, he noticed that the secret staircase was still open, the one that led into the lower part of the basement. As he walked further to the end of the stairs, he paused. As he looked into the main lab, a feeling of remorse fell over him as he looked to the room where the leader was operated on by the professor. He noticed it was being patched up, and the fire was gone. M then took a moment to collect his thoughts and continued down the stairs. He ran into the bottom of the basement and looked off the balcony to see the machine he was in. It hadn't been taken down yet, as the professor was quite busy the majority of the time. He walked to the end of the hallway where the professor's secondary office was. After knocking once, he opened the door and saw Assistant Steve standing in the corner, charging, and the professor hard at work in deep thought. Assistant Steve powered up as the professor looked over at him. M explained that he wanted to open the kingdom up to the rest of the world right then and there. The professor contemplated for a moment and told him that he was the leader now, and it was his decision and his alone. Assistant Steve then chimed in, speaking bluntly and without a single thought for emotion about how dangerous this could be. M cut him off, saying that he only speaks logically and that some decisions need to be made with a level of emotion. Professor then questioned him on what he meant. M stated that he found a new inspiration for his actions, and Professor Red simply nodded slightly as M ran out of the lab with anticipation for the future. M stood on the platform that the Red Steves had set up for speeches and looked out onto the sea of Steves in front of him. After taking a deep breath and thinking for one last moment, he began to speak. He spoke of his plan and that they would be revealing themselves to the rest of the world. Some of the Steves whispered to one another in doubt, not knowing how to feel about this new notion. After clearing his throat, he spoke once more, reassuring them that this plan would work, and that he was going later that day to reveal himself to the rest of the leaders. After contacting Light Steve about his idea, M went to the garden that he used to teleport secretly many times before. He looked around and took a deep breath, focused, and in a flurry of lightning teleported to the location Light Steve told him to go to. After teleporting, he walked into the abandoned library, the place where he had first met Sabre. And as he looked at it, he saw Light Steve had repurposed it as a meeting place for all of the leaders. After contacting Light about his idea, Light had gathered all of the leaders there, and M revealed himself to them as a Red Steve. After explaining himself, they all agreed to make announcements in their kingdoms, and welcomed the Red Steves back into the society. Once the meeting had ended, the leaders all went back to their respective kingdoms and dimensions. Orange Leader and Light, being the last to leave, turned to M and told him that they had a memorial for Sabre back at the Orange Kingdom, if he ever wanted to visit it. M nodded, and the two of them teleported away. After everyone had left, M walked out of the library, and as he stared silently, he quietly honored his friend. After a minute or two, he turned and walked into the spruce forest that was next to the library, looked around and found the spot Sabre had first seen his true identity. He stood there in one more moment of silence, reminiscing of the past, then teleporting back to the Red Kingdom. A little while had passed now, and the other leaders held up their end of the deal and told their people about the existence of the Red Steves. As time passed, the Red Kingdom started getting more and more visitors from other kingdoms, along with the Steve Village, which caught wind of the news pretty quickly from Light and Green Steve. At first, the Red Steves were quite nervous about new people in their kingdom, but eventually became more open and accustomed to their new acquaintances. The other Steves then started to show the Red Steves the outside world, some of which had seen it, and some who had not. With Red Steves able to explore the outside kingdom, the age of discovery had begun, with them finding some new things along with some old. And with the defense no longer needed, the professor and assistant were working on repurposing the Redstone Towers. Once that was done, Professor Red wanted to do something more, and decided to return to the original Red Kingdom. He wanted to give some honor to his original home. With the help of Assistant Steve, he began to return it to its former glory. M, remembering the stories in the Red Kingdom library about the once great academy, decided to create another one, not just for Red Steves, but for all Steves to obtain knowledge and learn about the world they live in. Speaking of which, with exploration allowed once more, some Red Steves, after talking to the Yellow Leader, went on an expedition to the Great Library, and while destroyed, the little knowledge that resided there was still important. It would be put in the new academy, for all to read and learn from. The new core that the professor was working on was also put to good use to upgrade Assistant Steve and bring energy and power to all the kingdoms. Professor Red took complete advantage of the fact that he could leave the Red Kingdom and decided to go on some adventures, gathering things he had left behind and experimenting with some technology, both from when he was young and things he was experimenting with now. M, now publicly the Red Leader, participated in meetings with the other leaders regularly, planning things and making sure everything went smoothly. But he also went there for personal reasons. And now that he could roam freely, he could pay proper respects to the friend that taught him almost as much as his mentor, and was there for him through the hardest points in his life, thanked him for his advice on being a leader, and always doing his best, even when all hope had seemed lost. And with M's newfound leadership and the limit on an adventure in the Red Kingdom fading away, that concludes Rainbow Quest Aftermath, the Red Kingdom. Many stories continue past the time loop, and we will be talking about these stories throughout an 8-part series called Rainbow Quest Aftermath. This was episode 1, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.